Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining, and welcome to today's webinar on the Radio Frequency RF Radiation Awareness Program for the construction industry. My name is Jessica Bunting, and I'm the host and tech support for this event. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few logistical things, which you can also see on your screen. If you're having technical difficulties, feel free to contact me at any time, either using the chat and Q&A box or via email at jbunting@cpwr.com. If you're having trouble with sound quality logged in through your computer, try disconnecting and calling in via phone. The number is right there on your screen. It's also on your event info tab and in any of the emails that you've received throughout the event from WebEx. We will answer questions at the end of today's presentation. Please enter your questions at any time during the presentation. We will do our best to answer as many as possible at the end of the event. And everyone will be receiving a recording of today's event and a copy of the presentation via email probably tomorrow. And with that, I will hand it over to Eileen Betit, CPWR's R2P Director, to get us started.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, our Radiation Awareness Program for the construction industry that's being presented by the National Roofing Contractors Association and the United Union of Roofers and Waterproofers and Allied Workers as part of their Research to Practice partnership with us. When the partnership was established, a decision was made to explore the potential risks from working in close proximity to different types of antennas located on rooftops. And when this topic was raised with a broader construction audience, we learned that others in the industry also had questions and concerns. And so this led to the establishment of a labor management RF radiation work group made up of other unions and contractor associations interested in learning more about the potential risks and how to prevent exposures. Today's presentation is intended to briefly introduce the awareness program that resulted from the partnership and the work group's efforts. Our presenters today are Tom Shanahan, the Vice President for Enterprise Risk Management and Executive Education for the National Roofing Contractors Association, and Keith Vitkovich, the Executive Director for the Roofers and Waterproofers Research and Education Joint Trust Fund. Today, Tom will provide a brief overview of the questions this program was developed to address, and then Keith will describe the materials in the program and ways they've been used so far to raise awareness. At the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. But before I turn the floor over to Tom and Keith, I just wanted to mention that as the name of the program states, it's intended to raise awareness, and the content was developed based on information available to us when we put the program together. We're still learning, and as new information is brought to our attention, we're updating the program and noting updates in the online resources. So we welcome feedback and questions. Just let us know if there's information missing or that needs to be updated. Questions that we don't have time for or answers to today, we'll follow up on after this webinar. So with that, I'll turn the things over to Tom.
Thanks, Eileen. So we should be on the slide with the growth in cellular antenna sites and subscribers. And when I saw this for the first time, it was jarring to me. And that's why we really wanted to start with it here. Just to get a sense of the exposure to RF radiation. According to CTIA, yeah?
Tom, sorry to interrupt you, but you're breaking up a little bit. I could hear you fine before, so I don't know if you switched to speaker or off of speaker or something.
No, but let me see if I can. Is that any better?
I think so.
Is that a little better?
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
What I was saying is on the slide here that we have the growth in cellular antenna sites. When we had first seen this, I actually was at a joint labor management meeting that I was at where there was a presentation given on this. You know, just shocked at the amount and how the numbers of exposure sites that were that are out there that in our particular case that roofing workers are exposed to. So according to the CPIA, the Wireless Association, looking at between 1985 and 2015, as you'll see there, the estimated number of cellular subscribers grew from around 340,000 to more than 377 million, and the number of cellular antennas sites increased from 913 to more than 300,000. So in 2014, the number of cell sites dropped off a little bit to just under 300,000 because of replacement equipment, what have you, but that the numbers continue to increase, as you can see, over well over 300,000. What that means for contractors and workers in the roofing and other construction trades is that we're increasingly encountering RF generating devices in areas that we work. We can go to the next slide. So some of the questions that our work group set out to answer were, what is RF radiation? What is it used for? What are the potential health effects? Who's at risk? Are there regulations or guidelines for this? What does the hazard look like, or potential hazard look like if there was one? And what can be done? So that's what we set out to do. So getting started with the first question, what is RF radiation? And to answer that, it's important that there are two types of radiation, ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. Both are forms of electromagnetic energy, but ionizing has more energy than non-ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation is like X-rays or gamma rays and has enough energy to cause chemical changes by breaking chemical bonds. Sources of this type of radiation can be found, for example, in hospitals, nuclear energy plants, and nuclear weapon facilities. Non-ionizing, however, causes molecules to vibrate, which generate heat. And RF radiation is a type of non-ionizing radiation, and that's really the focus of our attention. So the next slide here, we can see that, what is it used for commonly? So we got microwaves, radar, industrial heating and cooling processes, medical applications, and you can see all the telecommunication broadcasting operations there, which a lot of those, of course, are the ones that we come in contact. So common uses, as you can see from all of those things, for telecommunication broadcast in particular is the one that we're most concerned about because, like I said, the equipment is frequently on rooftops. And as you'll see later, many times, which really got my attention, are hidden. So we go to the next slide. So some of the potential health effects. So as we talked about earlier, the thermal effects. So the proliferation of those cellular antennas and other RF generating devices, has really raised these questions about the health effects. The short-term thermal health effects are known and occur when the body cannot deal with the heat buildup caused by RF radiation quickly enough, so it can't dissipate it. So this buildup is dependent on the frequency and intensity of the RF radiation fields, as well as the length of time the worker is exposed and how close he or she is from that working from the source, rather. Symptoms of overexposure include, for example, labored breathing, perspiring, and an immediate sensation of intense heating of the parts of the body exposed, headaches, even a reddening of the skin due to the inflammation. These symptoms are often attributed to the strenuous nature of the work being performed or are considered non-occupational illnesses. However, according to OSHA, exposures at sufficiently high power densities, RF MW energy, can use thermal effects that can cause blindness or sterility. So that's right out of the OSHA language. In addition, workers who come in direct contact with RF generating antenna that's energized or hot may suffer severe burns. And these burns can be deep and may be worse than they appear initially. The FCC cautions that exposures to RF radiation could cause pacemakers and other mechanical devices to malfunction and encourage individuals at risk to check with their doctor before performing work in areas where there's a potential to be exposed. Since little is known about the potential long-term health effects of occupational exposures for construction workers, our work group opted to take a precautionary approach and provide contractors and workers with information and help to avoid overexposures in the first place. So on our next slide there, understanding who's at risk, right? So the short answer is anybody who works where RF generating devices are located, they're at risk of exposure. So within the construction industry, many of the contractors and workers they employ, including those listed above on our slide here, may perform work where those devices are located. And so one of the things that has concerned us is in the roofing industry, for example, just to give you an aside, is we've got these various workers who could be up there, but because roofs now are being used for a lot more aesthetic reasons, like for gardens and space where people could just go and meet, they may not know that there's exposures up there as well. So there's just a lot more people using roofs these days. So the next slide says, are there regulations and guidelines? Obviously, we were concerned about that and wondering if our workers would be and our contractors would be in compliance. So there are regulations intended to protect workers at the federal, state, and local levels. And let's start with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. It has the most authority since it has jurisdiction over all licensed transmission services, the sources of RF, except those operated by the federal government, of course. Under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the FCC is required to consider human exposure to radio frequency radiation because transmitting devices that fall within its jurisdiction have a high potential for creating significant RF exposure to humans. The FCC requires telecommunication providers, so the owners of the equipment and their licensees, to conduct RF emission compliance studies where the devices are located to ensure that they do not pose a health risk. The resulting report should include the steps that are being taken to protect workers and the general public. The FCC's exposure guidelines are outlined in the OET Bulletin 65 called Evaluating Compliance with FCC Guidelines for Human Exposure to Radio Frequency Electromagnetic Fields. The guidelines include information on the maximum permissible exposure limits, the MPEs, what owners of RF generating telecommunications equipment must do to comply with occupational and public exposure limits, methods to determine compliance, signage requirements, and other policies designed to protect telecommunication workers and the general public, which of course includes construction workers. OSHA has an exposure limit of 10 milliwatts per square centimeters, and the Institute for Electrical Engineers has developed voluntary standards for RF that are recognized by ANSI and referenced in the FCC guidelines. And there are several states and cities and jurisdictions that have their own standards or programs for RF. So it ends up being kind of complicated for any contractor, for example, employer, or even workers wanting to know and understand all these things. So as we consider what the potential hazard looks like, if you go to the next slide there, like I mentioned before, while the regulations, guidelines, and programs are intended to prevent workers and the public from exposure to hazardous levels of RF, they are only protective if employees and employees are able to identify whether or not a hazard is present. And so you can see from the chart that shows some examples of RF generating devices and where they're located. And some of them, many of them, actually are not easy to spot at all. Others, such as one concealed in his chimney, you can see the arrow there, along the flagpole, and we even see now that they're on light posts, for example, in streets, are not readily recognized at all. In fact, one of the other images that I couldn't find was of a workers working on a church steeple, and within the steeple was an active RF antenna. And you know, when they talked to the church leaders, they said, well, we got approached by a certain company. They said they would pay us to have this, and we could.
Tom, we can't hear you. You've just faded out.
Is that any better now?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Eileen. So what I was saying was that there's exposure areas like, for example, in church steeples where workers are working and they're unaware of active RF antenna being hidden in the steeple itself, even though they might be painting them or what have you. And that gave us great cause for concern, as you can see in these other pictures here as well. So the next slide, here says what can be done to work safely. So what we want to do is first to find out if RF generating devices are present and where they're located and who to contact if you need to perform work in that area. There are several ways to do this. You could, of course, and recommend that you ask the building owner or site manager if antennas or other radio frequency generating devices are present and request a copy of the RF survey or site plan. The FCC, of course, requires telecommunications providers, as I mentioned before, the licensees or owners of the equipment, to conduct RF emission studies to ensure that their sites do not present a health risk. This compliance study and report is supposed to be maintained on site and should contain information on the hazardous areas and contact information for the antenna owner or the designee. So even if the building owner or manager can't produce a plan, they should know whether or not telecommunications equipment is actually present, the contact information for each device, and if and where signs are posted. Some owners may have detailed information accessible through their websites, and the table on this slide, for example, is from Boston University's website and shows the location and number of antennas and the type of signage. It also includes a point of contact for more specific information about the antennas, which of course is great. It's not something that we typically see consistently, but it is important to be searching these things out. So looking for signs such as the one we see above, or other barriers or fences that follow the instructions and do not cross them if they are set up to restrict access. It's important to conduct a visual pre-task assessment to check for visible devices and check online sources before you begin to work. There are several resources online, and the steps to use them outlined in the RF guide that Keith will talk about in a little bit here. So of course, exercising caution becomes very, very important in these stealth, if you will, antennas. Given that the power levels and as a result exposure levels rather are always fluctuating, if work needs to be performed within potentially hazardous areas, it's best to always exercise caution. So for example, assume all antennas are active and operating in full power unless you have specific information in writing from the licensee that this is not the case. Stay away from the source and the direction of RF radiation, the direction that is being emitted. Pre-plan work tasks and travel routes so that you can limit trips through the RF field and time spent on tasks there. The goal is to get in and out as quickly as possible. If work must be performed in a potentially hazardous area, then we want you to contact the building manager and the antenna licensee to have the equipment powered down or, if possible, removed. Do not begin work until you receive verification that the antenna has been powered down or moved. If the device owner and building owner are unresponsive, then of course it's important to contact the FCC to file a complaint. Use of a personal RF monitor and RF protective clothing should only be used if they are part of a larger RF safety system. And if you notice symptoms of RF radiation, like we mentioned earlier, move to location. Again, it's really important to understand that it's easy to get out of that soon. Of course, the closer you are, the more important it is to just get out of it. Relatively easy to do. So that's a brief overview of the key questions that we wanted to answer. And now I'm going to ask Keith to review the program that we all came up with to address these issues.
Thank you, Tom. Unlike telecommunications, employees who maintain the equipment and know where the RF generating devices are located, the risk for exposure, and how to go about having equipment powered down when working in a hazardous area. Construction contractors and workers do not always have the same knowledge or control. Given the potential risk for early symptoms to be written off to weather conditions, the strenuous nature of the work, or an unrelated health issues such as the flu, and the unknowns about the long-term health effects of exposure to RF radiation, it's important to take steps to identify sources and avoid or address potentially hazardous situations. Our intent in developing this program wasn't to scare people, but to provide construction contractors and workers who need to perform work where these devices are located with information to help them identify potential hazards and avoid exposure. Our goal was to raise construction employers and workers' awareness of the potential risks associated with RF radiation exposure and to provide them information on how to identify an RF radiation hazard and take steps to work safely. Okay. The materials in the program provide detailed answers to the questions that Tom raised. What is RF radiation? What is it used for? What are the potential health effects? Who's at risk? Are there regulations or guidelines? And what does a potential hazard look like? And what can be done to work safely? The program includes a guide, electronic presentation, video, Toolbox Talk, and hazard alert card. The materials can be used for reference by a contractor preparing for a job, by trainers and instructors, or at safety meetings. They are designed to be used with both employers and workers and can be used independent of each other or as part of a complete training program. The guide includes a section for each of the key questions and contains the most detailed information, including information on regulations, online resources, different ways to find the location of antennas, and the steps involved. It also includes links to the sources for all the information to make it easier for users and instructors to find more information about a specific topic. The electronic presentation also responds to the key questions and summarizes the information in a detailed guide. To help users, each slide contains notes in the note page section that explains the information shown on the slide. And the presentation can be tailored to include the level of detail appropriate for the different audiences at need. The video, titled Safe Transmission, RF Awareness for the Construction Industry, runs for roughly 16 minutes and provides a concise overview of the information covered in the program. It was adapted for use by all construction sectors from one developed and shared by the Mechanical Contractors Association of America. In addition, the program includes a hazard alert card titled RF Radiation and Invisible Danger. It is available in English in print and online in English and in Spanish. And finally, there's a Toolbox Talk in Spanish and English. This one uses a roofer in the example, but it can be adapted for other trades. So to summarize what we've covered, contractors and workers that perform work on rooftops, sides of buildings, and other structures need to be aware of RF generating devices because RF radiation is an invisible hazard. You can't see, smell, or touch it. RF radiation generating devices come in different shapes and sizes, and some are intentionally concealed for aesthetic reasons. Power levels generated by these devices vary. Levels can be well below the FCC's limits when work begins and then spike to dangerous levels without warning. The risk increases with the number of devices present. The closer a worker is to the RF field and the longer they work in it. Symptoms of the thermal effects of overexposure are often attributed to the nature of the work or non-occupational illness. RF radiation may interfere with pacemakers and other devices, and limited research has been done on the long-term health effects of occupational exposure to RF for construction workers. The complete program is available online. Of course, you can see here at the top of the page, you would just have to go to www.cpwr.com, click on Research, scroll down, click on RF Radiation Awareness, and then, of course, you can download the presentation, the video, the hazard alert card, the Toolbox Talk, and the guide. And as Eileen said at the beginning, we welcome feedback and new information that will help protect workers in the industry. The goal of this program is to raise awareness and avoid health issues today and for the future. And now I will turn this over to Eileen and Jessica.